With the good old glasses. Well, good morning. My name is Paulo Sotero. I'm the director of the Brazil Institute at the Wilson Center. On behalf of the Wilson Center, I would like to welcome you. We are starting a new phase here with the arrival tomorrow of our new president, Jane Harman, former congresswoman from California, that has been appointed to replace Lee Hamilton. So the new phase, new life at the Woodrow Wilson Center at the Brazil Institute. I thank you for responding to our invitation for this discussion on prospects for Brazilian-American relations on the eve of President Obama's visit to Brazil. This visit will take place in March 19th and 20 in Brasilia, in Rio. Before introducing all the speakers that will be with us most of the morning, I would like to give a warm welcome to Ambassador Mauro Vieira, who will start us off with a few remarks. Ambassador Mauro Vieira is a dear friend. We met when I was a young journalist in Washington, and he was an even younger diplomat in Washington in 1980. And Ambassador Vieira has a very interesting career as a diplomat, and I will like to highlight only he served in many important places, but I think he is one of the few Brazilian diplomats that had the opportunity to serve as ambassador to the two most important countries as far as Brazil bilateral relations, which is Argentina and the United States. Actually, Ambassador Vieira came last year from Argentina, from Buenos Aires, and has been served since here in Washington, is now obviously involved in assisting preparation of this very important moment in our bilateral relationship, which is the visit by President Obama, and I understand his whole family, to Brazil. The ambassador will have an opportunity to tell us if that is correct or not. With that, I would like to invite Ambassador Mauro Vieira to start us off, and then we will continue after. And the ambassador will have to leave. He has another commitment, so after he speaks, we will just excuse him and me, because I will accompany the ambassador, and then I'll come back and we'll start the conversation here. Thank you very much, Ambassador Vieira.
Well, thank you very much, Paulo. Paulo, it's true, Paulo is a longtime friend and good friend. The only thing that I would like to make a clear point is that, to my knowledge, I'm not the only one, only Brazilian diplomat and ambassador to have served in both countries, which are true at the top for Brazil. But to my knowledge, three ambassadors, at least in modern times, modern considering the 70s on. One of them was João Batista Pinheiro, who was my first boss here, and he was ambassador in Germany, Japan, and many other important assignments too, but he was also ambassador in Buenos Aires and Washington. The second one is Ambassador Azeredo da Silveira, who was also a foreign minister for a long time, and after leaving the post, he came to Washington as ambassador, and he retired sometime later. And the third one, and it's maybe the first one to my knowledge, was Ambassador João Carlos Muniz in the 60s, maybe. He was also ambassador in Buenos Aires, United Nations, and Washington, where he retired. But, well, all of this just as an introduction to thank you again, Paulo, for this invitation with such distinguished members in the panel and also such a distinguished audience. I would like to start saying that it's really a privilege for me to be Ambassador of Brazil in the United States at this moment. There is no doubt we are in an excellent level of bilateral relations, and I think that there is a feeling in both countries that our relations are essential, they are a priority, they are strategic, and they are at excellent level. And I felt after I arrived in Washington that here in the United States there is a new feeling about Brazil. When I was here, as Paulo mentioned, I arrived in 78 as a third secretary, my first assignment abroad. The relations were quite different. We only talked about trade, and we had more of a negative agenda than anything else. And it was a completely different time, a completely different world, and especially Brazil was a different country, and a very different country. But I realized that today the image that Brazil has in the United States is quite different. And this, of course, has a lot of impact and has a lot of influence in our bilateral relations. We now discuss and talk with the United States not only the bilateral agenda, which still involves a lot of trade questions and trade policies and so on, but we also talk and discuss about regional issues concerning our immediate neighbors, our neighbors in the whole Western Hemisphere and around the world. And we also, of course, talk about global issues, which are very important. We talk about global governance and from a very different list of issues, from climate change to world governance to trade, international trade, and WTO, and so on. But I started saying that this is a very timely discussion too, because as you know, last week I had the pleasure to host in Washington the first visit as such of our new foreign minister, Ambassador Antônio Patriota, who was also my predecessor here, not only here but also in Brasilia. I was his predecessor. He succeeded me as chief of cabinet to the foreign minister, the former foreign minister, Celso Amorim. And he came in this visit for very important bilateral meetings in preparation for the upcoming visit of President Obama to Brazil. And he met, among others meetings he met with Secretary of State and Secretary of Treasury, and also the National Security Advisor, Mr. Donilon. And he had very productive talks with all his interlocutors, and he also saw other people. He also met with the president of World Bank and a few other important meetings too. But as Paulo mentioned, and it's been officially announced, President Obama will be visiting Brazil in a few days, or not, a little more than 2 weeks. He will be arriving in Brasilia on the 19th of March and staying till the morning of the 20th and visiting Rio, and then leaving to Chile and to El Salvador. This is considered to be a quite long trip, a long visit for a state visit. Today, heads of states do not have time to spend in long visits as it used to be the case in the past. But we consider that a 2-day visit is a very important one. It's long enough to give him a good idea of the country. Of course, he has a lot of information. He received all this information not only as a senator, as a politician, but as a candidate, as the president. But it's different when you go and see by yourself. When I presented my credentials to President Obama about a year ago, he told me that he had never been to Brazil and he wanted to go to Brazil, and especially to Rio de Janeiro. What pleased me a lot, being my hometown, and I'm sure he will enjoy it. And but this is also a sign of a new era, a new phase, maybe in the foreign policy of the United States. I think that this outreach to Latin America is very important. He's not only visiting Brazil, but two other important and relevant countries which have a lot of importance in bilateral trade and investment, and especially in policy and politics discussions and policy discussion and building consensus in the region. Just as a historic register, and we have here in the audience a lot of important historians and people who know a lot about our bilateral relations. This is not something new, a visit of American president to Brazil, and it's as bilateral visits are not new. The first visit we have a register of was a very long, a 3-month visit in 1876 by the Emperor of Brazil, Pedro II. He came on a very long visit and he traveled the country from the east to the west coast. He visited New York, and also he visited the west coast, and he was present with President Ulysses Grant at the opening of the Philadelphia exhibition that year when the centennial of the American independence was celebrated. But this is not the only one. Maybe this is a curiosity in our bilateral history, but we have had a total of, we have counted 22 visits of Brazilian heads of states to the United States, and about 14 the other way around. Some of these were truly historic events, such as Franklin Roosevelt visiting Brazil in 1943, when Brazil was helping the Allied war effort and soon would be fighting side by side with U.S. troops in Italy. But I think that this is, of course, part of the history, but of more modern history, we have maybe a turning point, and this refers to the visits of both visits of President Bush to Brazil in 2005 and 2007, and the two visits of bilateral visits of President Lula to Brazil, but especially the second one in 2007 when he met with President Bush in Camp David. I think that these two, they deserve a special mention because, as I said, from these visits, these 3 visits on, I think that our dialogue was raised to a superior level, and that we started talking, as I mentioned before, about not only regional but bilateral, regional, and global issues. This trend, which was started by previous administrations, both in Brazil and the United States, was also confirmed when President Obama took office, and with whom President Lula continued to discuss and to talk about global economic recovery to climate change, just to mention 2 important areas. And this is a central element in our relationship, and of course it remains so under Presidents Rousseff and President Barack Obama tenure as presidents. They will be meeting soon in Brasilia, and they will pursue this avenue of global dialogue. I just would like to mention a few areas in which we do have this important exchange of views and opinions, but I also would like to say that as any new administration, President Rousseff will bring to the table her own priorities and her own nuances. There are some promising paths to be explored, and that hopefully will prove to be of great opportunities and for cooperation for both countries. But many of the areas which are important for both countries, and I would mention 4 or 5, as I said. First one is human rights, but considered in a very wide aspect. Both countries and both heads of states are very interested in all gender questions, especially having a woman as the first president of Brazil, and also in the promotion of not only gender, but the promotion of racial equality. And we have started about 2 years ago a program, the Joint Action Plan to fight racial discrimination and to promote racial equality, and I think this continues to be in a very high priority in our bilateral agenda. But President Rousseff, as in her previous positions as Minister of Mines and Energy and also Chief of Staff, she was also very much involved in business and trade and economic issues. And she values a lot this cooperation between our two countries, and she was very central in the creation of the CEO Forum, which is one of our bilateral mechanisms, which gathers 10 important businessmen, important CEOs from each side, together with officials, government officials. And in our side, it's the Chief of Staff to the President and the Minister of Trade and Industry, and the same on the U.S. side, the Secretary of Commerce and the Chief Advisor for Economic Affairs to the President. This is a very important forum of discussion. A lot of synergy has come out of it, and a lot of important proposals have been approved by both governments as a result of these discussions. I also would like to mention the social policies of both countries. In Brazil, we are committed to a policy of social inclusion, and which has as a name the economic growth as a way to include more people in the consumer society. As a result, during the last 8 years, during the 2 periods, the 2 terms of President Lula, we had a big social movement, an upward movement in our society, with millions, some 20 millions living the line below poverty, and another 25 million being taken into the middle classes. But and also another important area in which both countries are interested and both presidents are very much involved is also the cooperation and the development in science, technology and innovation. President Rousseff, on her inaugural address in January 1st, she mentioned and she dedicated a big portion of her speech to consider the different aspects of science, technology, innovation, research. And it was a very good surprise for me to attend 3 weeks later the State of the Union and seeing that President Obama had the same views and expressed the same concerns and the same kind of projects. So I don't think this is the time to make a lot of announcements before the actual visit takes place, but I would suggest you to expect some interesting announcements in that field of innovation, science and technology. We have been working on ethanol and biofuels for a while now, and clean energy being such a high priority for President Obama, this is an obvious area where we should be cooperating more. But again, I'll leave the announcements to the appropriate moment during the visit. I just would like to mention 2 last items just before I pass the word to Paulo. Is that President Obama is going to Rio, besides Brasilia, and this is the ideal place to have a kind of interaction with civil society, as it's been planned by the U.S. government to take place in Rio, because everything that happens in Rio, Rio is the cultural capital of the country, and everything that happens in Rio echoes all over the country. I think this is a very good podium for him to send to Brazil and to the Western Hemisphere very important messages. But besides that, Rio will also be hosting two very important sports events of this decade. In 2014, the World Cup, and in 2016, the Olympics Games. And of course, we are interested in calling the attention of the U.S. businessmen to the opportunities that will result from these important events in matters of cooperation and investments that can be discussed and can be done to the benefit of our bilateral relations. And second thing I would like to mention is that Brazil, that I said at the beginning, we discussed in the past only trade issues with the United States. It doesn't mean that we do not have trade problems anymore. We still do. And one of the things that will take place will be also economic and trade issues to be discussed between the two heads of states. We had a very important evolution in our bilateral trade from 2007. We had an important surplus with the United States, and this shifted completely with the crisis, and now we have a huge deficit, $11 billion, which is huge compared to the size of our bilateral trade, which is something like $55, $56 billion. And of course, this is a question that has to be addressed properly. And we do want more trade, we do want more investment, but we do more balanced relation in this area. It's never been our aim to have a surplus with the United States or any other country. We want to have a complementary trade relation so that we can have the most of our national industries and production system. And this, again, will bring us to discussing items that are very important, such as multilateralism and multilateralism with relation to trade, which means the positive conclusion of the Doha round of the WTO, which we will all continue to work to have it as soon as possible. I don't want to take more of your time. The number of speakers and the experience they have in this area is much longer and much better than mine. So I thank you very much for coming and listening to me, and thank you again, Paulo and the Wilson Institute. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I think the ambassador will stay with us for a few minutes. We have a very good group of guests here today to talk to you and to discuss the issues that the visit that the ambassador had just outlined. I would like to remind the significance of this, and this is the old journalist in me speaking. Just before, less than a year ago, the relationship was in a much more difficult shape. You remember that the differences in the issue of the constitutional crisis in Honduras, also Brazil's effort, along with Turkey, to try to mediate between Iran and the international community, did not achieve the result that I think was intended. And cause, obviously, as we all know, a lot of tension in the relationship. The fact that both governments, and the government of President Rousseff, since the day of her election in October, made the moves, the two governments, to create this new environment, I think, and to make possible for President Obama to visit Brazil, I believe it's indicative of the desire of the commitment of the two governments, the two countries, to make this relationship work. I think what happened in the last few months is very significant in that regard. As the ambassador mentioned, this is a very old and traditional relationship. It's the oldest relationship Brazil has with any country. So I believe that for the United States is also a very important relationship as Brazil became a new quantity and quality in the global scene. I wanted to mention two things about this trip that is different from all the previous ones. It is the fact that this is the first time that the high-level bilateral dialogue between a Brazilian and a U.S. administration starts with the President of the United States visiting Brazil. All previous trips started with the Brazilian president coming here. Some of them actually started with the president-elect of Brazil coming here. That was happened in February of '85 with President-elect Tancredo Neves. I think President Collor also came as president-elect. I vividly remember the trip in December of 2002 by President-elect Lula. President Fernando Henrique Cardoso came here in '95 before President Clinton reciprocated in '97. And I think this is a significant, it may be a result only the calendar. It may be also, as Ambassador Mauro Vieira reminded me the other day, it's always important to keep sort of the correct order of those visits, that there is always retribution among the two countries and the two presidents. So it's time now, indeed, for the President of the United States to visit Brazil. But the timing of it, I think, is significant. I think it's indicative of some recognition by the United States that Brazil, as I mentioned, has become something different in the world scene. It's important to pay more and more consistent attention. The other thing the ambassador alluded to is context. I believe it's rare that two countries have domestic agendas that have so many parallels as we have right now. Fiscal situation, you have to keep those things in proportion. Obviously, the fiscal situation, the debt situation of the United States is much more serious than the debt situation in Brazil. But the fiscal challenge is similar, and in both countries, what the governments are looking for is to improve the quality of public spending. And actually, the two presidents say precisely that. Issues of infrastructure, you heard President Dilma, you hear President Obama talk about that. The same in education and innovation, central to both administrations. And I wanted to call your attention to the absolutely exceptional team that President Rousseff assembled to lead that challenge in Brazil. And I'm very glad to hear that there will be cooperation. There has always been cooperation in that area. Some of the best achievements of Brazil are actually a result of cooperation with the United States, starting with Embraer and moving with it in other areas. So this is a very interesting that's a very interesting development. Well, the ambassador has already alluded to the bilateral what is intended to, and I think that we are going to start probably to see, to move beyond the issue of just having working groups. We have more than 20 now, and start to make working groups produce results. The CEO Forum, for instance, which was in a sense a working group, has produced one. Some facilitation in terms of visas, but there are other things on the table. And and there are difficult issues, and there are indeed difficult issues, as the ambassador mentioned. I believe that one of this, from my experience of covering this as a journalist, I think that the less hype, the better. I remember many trips, the president comes here or the president from the United States goes to Brazil, and people talk immediately about relaunching and a strategic relation, etc. I think that from what we heard from the ambassador, from all the things that my observation, it's possible to build the elements of a relationship that can rise to become strategic. But I think that it's important to be realistic about especially the difficulties that exist in both countries domestically to rise to that level. So, and to concentrate, instead of making big pronouncements, to concentrate on the task ahead and produce results. As you know, one of the, and something that we may discuss, it's already been discussed in the media in Brazil, which is a recognition by the United States of Brazil's ascent in the world. There has always been, there will always be expectation that one day the United States will support Brazil's ascension to permanent membership at the UN Security Council. I believe that in the next 5 years it will happen. I believe that the Security Council will be reformed because in 5 years, if it's not reformed, it will look pretty weird. For that reason, I believe that it will change because I believe in the law of gravity. There is such thing also in politics, in world affairs, as countries change their relative position in the world. And I personally have a hunch, I don't have any information on this, but now that I am not a correspondent, I can say those things. I have a hunch that based on what Secretary Hillary Clinton told in public to Ambassador Patriota, to Foreign Minister Patriota the other day, I believe what President Dilma Rousseff will hear from President Obama on that topic will probably satisfy her on the commitment of the United States to continue this discussion and to move to what has to happen, which is to change, to do in the political realm what has been done in the economic realm. We are not talking about G7, G8 anymore, we are talking about G20. I think the governance also in security affairs has to move to another level, and we will have at some point a Security Council of the United Nations that will better reflect global realities, which it does not right now. Now, we have to talk about all this. Some very good friends of the Brazil Institute, and I would like to introduce them to you. You have the bios, but I will introduce them to you in the order they will speak. First of all, a dear friend of mine and a supporter of the Brazil Institute, a member of the Brazil Institute Advisory Council, a former U.S. ambassador to the OAS, former Deputy Secretary General of the organization, and a dear friend for many years who just recently finished writing a paper for the National Defense University, where he is now as a fellow, on Brazil and the United States, the need for strategic engagement. I think that the title defines the challenge. So after we hear from Ambassador Rinaldi, we'll hear from another dear friend, Ambassador Craig Kelly, who was until last year the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Western Hemisphere Affairs, former ambassador to Chile, now at the Cohen Group here in town. We will hear also from dear friend Carl Meacham. Carl, who has been to many of our discussions, is a senior advisor, staff advisor to the Foreign Relations Senate committee where he works closely with Senator Lugar. Then we will hear from Luis Bittencourt. Luis has obviously not only as a friend, but also he started this. Luis is the founding father of the Brazil Institute. He started this when Ambassador Rubens Barbosa was here, and he started as the Brazil Project and laid the foundation for the work that we do now. Luis is now a dean at the National Defense University. He has a long career in public service, and will talk to us a bit on cooperation in the defense area. And this is important because last year Brazil and the United States signed an agreement in that area. And last but not least, a dear friend, also Carolina Costa, who has worked before in Washington, left to return to Brazil, and while in Brazil worked for a trade association of sugarcane association in Brazil, also worked for an American company, got married in Brazil to an American, and came back. and Carol is a dear, dear friend. But I would like to, with that, to ask Ambassador Reinaldo to summarize his paper. If you want, on March 10th, we will have another discussion here that will feature Leslie Bethel, the senior scholar for the Brazil Institute, who will present on the history of Brazil as a global actor. It may, for those that don't follow those things, it may surprise you that Brazil is now acting globally. Brazil has always thought in acting that way, to have a presence in the world commensurate to the size of the country, and in democracy commensurate to our ambition to be a player and a positive player in world affairs. So on the 10th of March, Leslie Bethel, who is with us, will present on that, and Ambassador Reinaldo will discuss his presentation, guided in large part on this same paper that he will summarize here today. So if you excuse me just for a second, I will accompany the ambassador, and we'll come back, and then we will start with Luis Reinaldo. Okay? In 1 second, I'll be back. Thank you.
Yes.
You want to speak here? Go
Yeah.
there.
I'll speak here. Okay. Thank you very much, Paulo. Thank you, Ambassador Vieira. I'm glad to be here to see this group of friends. And I notice people not just from Brazil, but also from some of Brazil's neighbors. I did write a paper on Brazil, which is about to be published. It's actually going to be printed today, I think, in English, and later in the week in Portuguese. I'm not a Brazilianist. I know and respect Brazil and have worked with Brazil a great deal. But I was driven to write it because I felt there was a great need for it here in the United States. I don't think in this audience, perhaps, but I was forced, actually it's on the first page of my paper, to write as simple a sentence as Brazil is Brazil. It's part of Latin America, but it's not Latin America. It's part of the third world, but it's not the third world. Brazil is Brazil. Just as the United States is the United States, just as China is China, these are unique countries. Now, I mentioned the three together. I don't know that any of you can see this. It will be in the paper once it's published. but I simply superimposed a map in green of Brazil on the outline of China in yellow and the United States in red. And what comes out simply is a single blob. In effect, the size is 8 million square kilometers each approximately for the United States and Brazil, and 9 for China. For most Americans, and this particular paper was born when, at the start of December, I was talking to a senior chap who has been in and out of senior positions in the U.S. government and actually even had visited Brazil 20 years ago to give some lectures. And he said, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. And suddenly it became apparent that it really was ready. It was time to try to do something that would break through the American image, the predominant American image of Brazil. That image, I suppose, is one that is conditioned by record inflation, forgetting that that inflation basically ended 20 years ago, by poverty, overlooking or being unaware of the fact that poverty has been dramatically reduced in Brazil over the last decade at least. Sense that the population is small and Indian and black, and that's important, that there are 70,000 Indians in Brazil, in the Amazon, but there are 200 million Brazilians. And I guess it's my personal experience. My wife's mother emigrated from Poland to the United States, and her sister emigrated from Poland to Brazil. And they were both coming to the New World. And that similarity in origin and image is a very important one that is far more representative of the reality of Brazil than of the images that, in fact, at one stage, when I was leaving public service, I once thought I would get a contract to rewrite American history textbooks that refer to Latin America. In high school, often they only refer to the Amazon and the Indians. And when you start with that perception, you just have trouble overcoming it and realizing what we're dealing with in a country that is exploding economically, steadily growing, and interestingly enough, one of the measures of the change is increasing as a proportion of what it produces compared to that of its region. In other words, it used to be a fairly low percentage in the 30s of the economic wealth produced in South America. Today, that number has increased to the 50s. So we can add a lot of other images that we carry about Brazil, because we carry the images of instability, of military rule. There was a time, I remember, and the image was justified in many specific ways, when there was an entire campaign run in this country entitled Torture in Brazil. There was repression, there was military rule, but as is often the case with a large country, that's not all there ever was. And now we are seeing a country that runs in the opposite direction of what these images are. Because if you look at the history of Brazil, it is essentially a history of peaceful progress without the violence either of revolution to accompany independence. Independence of Brazil was declared by the emperor, head of the Portuguese Empire. The transition from the empire to the republic was nonviolent. Brazil's ability to consolidate and end its borders with its neighbors was by treaty. There is, in other words, a record of Brazilian achievement that is essentially centered on negotiation and peace. It's an interesting question, because if I'm not a Brazilianist, I am a diplomat. And in my diplomatic career, I kept running into Brazil. In the 1980s with the Rio Group. When I went to the OAS, the Secretary General was a Brazilian, and he had surrounded himself with a corps of ambassadors, many of whom had served with him in Brasilia when he was Secretary General of Itamaraty, the Brazilian Foreign Ministry. When the Clinton administration organized the first Summit of the Americas, they probably would not have been able to succeed without the decision of the Rio Group and led by Brazil to go along and make it work. Then, when it was time for me, pushed by Alec Watson, thank you, who is in our audience, to become involved in trying to find peace between Ecuador and Peru. It was Brazil that was the chair of the Rio Protocol group of guarantors that provided the framework within which we had to work, and which, when the United States felt overexposed and could no longer keep its Black Hawk helicopters in the difficult jungles, the Brazilians got their own Black Hawks and replaced us. And yet, through all of this, though I was seeing a Brazilian foreign policy that was creating useful frameworks internationally, and as a Western Hemisphere person, fundamentally, I was not present at the founding of UNCTAD or the G77 or many of the other institutions that Brazil helped to create. I found a great diffidence. On the American side, basically not seeing Brazil, seeing just another Latin American country. And on the Brazilian side, a growing alienation from a United States that seemed to be unwilling to accept Brazil's presence and interests. It was a good friend of mine who was ambassador here of Brazil in Washington, Araújo Castro, who came up in the 70s with the theory of the United States as essentially seeking to freeze world power, meaning to arrange world power in ways that would increase or maintain its power and prevent the rise of countries like Brazil to challenge it. Out of these tensions, I think, arose an alienation. Today it has been said everything is going to go well. Let us hope. I think it's vital that it do go well and that we not be trapped in illusions. If we are worried about perceptions, the basic issue facing us is that the United States needs to not only recognize Brazil's rise, but welcome it and realize that it is a country that has many characteristics, culturally and otherwise, that are very much in tune with ours. That, of course, will require, and I would put global way ahead of regional or bilateral. I think it is essential that we have regular global consultations with Brazil, which will be very hard for us. We are not organized, really, to do that. We do have a secret weapon on the second general point. I think it's important. These two countries are amazing countries, the United States and Brazil, but somehow, though they have them, there are some people who are here, they lack personal interpreters. One of my countries that I would say I do know well, unlike Brazil, is Peru. And one of my Brazilian friends once said to me, you know, you have more Peruvianists in the United States than Brazilianists. And I don't know how true that is. But I do feel, in spite of the skepticism with which my good friend Harry is reacting to these words, I do feel that there is often a miss in our relations because we, from the U.S. side, don't see the personalism with which Brazilian life and culture are suffused. And in that sense, yes, we have a great secret weapon in the President of the United States. And I think in his style and his family's style, as we mentioned earlier. But I think that the relations are going to have to go way, way beyond that. And let me end with 2 points. First, I think we need to play to strengths, each of us. And Brazil, which has occasionally, I think, shown a little bit of the hubris that has accompanied its own growth. And one of the other differences between, the similarities between the United States and Brazil is if you are in a normal situation, look at Paulo's favorite press, you discover quickly that foreigners generally don't count in either country because we're turned inward on our own strength and our own frontiers, first the physical ones and then those that we are creating for ourselves. And therefore it's sort of hard to, but Brazil can also succeed, needs to learn that it needs to cooperate with the United States more than it has in recent years. So there is a two-sided part to this. And I think one of the strengths that Brazil has, and I've implied it, is the experience in the general field of conflict resolution and multilateral negotiation. The U.S. needs to pay more attention to that and more attention generally to multilateral frameworks. The last point is this. The U.S. has had lots of problems with Latin America over the years with being simply too big. And when you're too big, there are asymmetries of power that are sort of inconceivable if you're an American, and oppressive if you're a small country in the Caribbean or Central America or even a lot of other places. Brazil is beginning to learn what the U.S. experience is. The great ideal of a unified South America, which is in the Brazilian Constitution, is one that not all South Americans outside of Brazil feel entirely comfortable with. And I think that one of the things that I want to leave is that another thing that the U.S. and Brazil now have in common is that being as relatively powerful as we are, we need to pay attention to our neighbors, to our common neighbors, and we need to pay attention to where rules of common conduct can be set in places like the OAS. And I'm happy to talk more, but I better shut up now.
Thank you very much, Luigi. Well, now we are going to hear from Ambassador Kelly. You wanted to come to the podium, please?
Paulo, thank you very much. Take my watch off so I can try and obey the rules of time here. It's a great pleasure to join not only so many well-informed commentators, but friends on this panel, including Luigi, whom I've known for many, many years. Also, as a native Californian, I would like to congratulate the Center for its good judgment in appointing a distinguished California congresswoman to head the Center. And I'm sure Jane Harman will do a fantastic job. I don't want to insult this audience by repeating things. There have been three really terrific presentations already, so I will try to complement those, focus a bit on the view of Brazil and the U.S.-Brazil relationship and the upcoming visit from the perspective of the State Department, which I left just 6 months ago, but I worked very closely with Ambassador Vieira, worked very closely with our ambassador in Brazil, Tom Shannon, and the current Assistant Secretary, Arturo Valenzuela. So I'll comment a little bit about the vision seen from Washington. And given the shortness in time, I'd like to reduce to a simple math equation, which is that rising economic power plus centrist pragmatic politics equal global influence. And of course, talking about Brazil here, that the tremendous boom in Brazil's economy, the fact that we have a strong development of pragmatic centrist politics has combined to create an influence in the world which I think is unprecedented. And I'll cite just a couple of statistics. This audience knows very well, on the economic side, for instance, why Brazil has been so successful. But just a few things that are very interesting and point out the rather unique situation and Brazil's success. 45% of Brazil's energy is from renewable sources, for instance. Brazil's the third largest generator of hydroelectric power and growing. Everyone is aware of the oil discoveries off the southeast coast, which will make Brazil one of the world's largest oil producers. Perhaps a less known story is the one about Brazilian agriculture, its incredible diversification and export potential around the world, not just potential but reality around the world, which actually reflects a great area of U.S.-Brazil cooperation among scientists and agronomists. Brazil is the third largest producer of aircraft, the fifth largest producer of cars and trucks. Foreign direct investment in Brazil amounted to $45 billion in 2008 before the recession. It dipped after the recession. It's climbing again. We'll probably reach that level again soon. Brazilian multinationals have reached an influence and a prestige around the world that is impressive. Financially, everyone knows that Brazil entered the recession late and came out of it early, was able to finance its own stimulus package through its own resources. A country that was once a debtor to the IMF is now a creditor, loans money to the IMF, another impressive aspect of the story. And I think to sum it up, a country which has so many natural resources in terms of agriculture, oil, and so forth, I think most experts would agree there is almost no risk of the famous Dutch disease, that a particular natural resource, whether it's soy or iron or oil, dominates the Brazilian economy to the extent that the other elements of the economy are squeezed out and are not able to compete internationally. That is not happening in Brazil. Brazil's economy is very highly diversified. So that's the economic part of the equation in brief. The political part of the equation, nobody was staying up late in Washington in the recent presidential elections worrying about who would win, because everyone was convinced that the general overall direction of the country wasn't going to change whoever won, José Serra or Dilma Rousseff. The direction of the country was not going to change significantly. And in that regard, Brazil joins other countries like Chile, where elections have become fairly non-dramatic, and that's a good thing. And I think in part that reflects a very interesting political tradition of cooperation among Chilean and Brazilian leaders who have traveled back and forth and have very strong ties. But it's a similarity between the two countries, non-dramatic, centrist, pragmatic politics that have as a goal trying to solve real problems that affect real people, and an end to the older traditions that have afflicted the hemisphere for too many years of leaders coming in trying to wipe the slate clean, start over, and sort of dramatize politics as opposed to seeking pragmatic solutions. Brazil has been a great success in that regard. This has translated, has helped facilitate what, as Paulo rightly notes, has always been a widespread global Brazilian influence. It's now much stronger these days because, I think, of the confluence of these events, economic and political. Now, what does that mean for the U.S.-Brazil relationship? Well, we work together in many, many areas. The OAS, the United Nations, several people have already cited some of the specific programs. Third country cooperation on biofuels. We work in the Caribbean and Central America and Africa on biofuels. We, of course, cooperate heavily in Haiti and are very much appreciative of the fact that Brazil leads the UN peacekeeping force there and suffered casualties in the earthquake. We have a defense cooperation agreement with Brazil. We cooperate on tropical forest conservation, food security, as Secretary Clinton noted last week, standing next to Foreign Minister Patriota, a key area of our cooperation. We're the two of the largest food producers in the world. We work very closely on food security. Our private sectors work closely together. You'll hear from Carolina shortly, but we have the CEO Forum, the Innovation Summit, and other bodies to talk more about the real-world issues in trade and investment. The ambassador noted the cooperation on the so-called action plan to eradicate racial discrimination. This is, as noted, an area where the United States and Brazil have some real similarities. Huge slave populations. In fact, it's not widely known in the United States that only a small fraction of the slaves that came to the New World came to the United States. And if you look at overall numbers of Afro-descendants, there are actually far more Afro-descendants in the Americas than there are indigenous populations today. This is not to diminish the importance of the cultural and political issues that surround indigenous issues. In fact, the State Department has worked hard to advance in that area, training diplomats in indigenous language, including Quechua and Aymara and so forth. But we're also trying to take a greater account of the importance of changes in society that seek to create greater social mobility for Afro-descendant populations as well, and that's why two very important Afro-descendant countries, the United States and Brazil, are working together in this program. To sum it up, our cooperation, as Paulo and as Ambassador Vieira noted, is global. It involves not just governments but also our societies, which is very, very important as an underpinning for a solid bilateral relationship. And to a degree that when we do have differences, and we do, and in the past year over Iran, over Honduras, over Cuba, some human rights issues, there were some differences, and perhaps we can talk about those in the question and answer session. I was involved in those three areas when I was still at the State Department, but we've handled those issues in the context of a very wide-ranging, positive relationship, as mature countries do. The Obama visit. First of all, I congratulate both countries for arranging this visit very early on in President Rousseffi's administration. I think it's a great thing and reflects justifiably the importance of the relationship between the two countries. As indicated, this visit, and it's very interesting to note, as Ambassador Vieira did when he gave this long list of issues that were likely to be raised, most of the issues he talked about were actually sort of society issues, connecting two societies, a favorite theme of Ambassador Shannon in Brazil. The diplomacy is not just about connecting governments, it's about connecting societies, private sector, scientists, students, and so forth. And that it will be a large focus of this visit, and I think that's a great way to reflect the complexity and the diversity of the relationship. I think the press will obviously note, facilitated, I think, by last week's visit by Foreign Minister Patriota, that the relationship with a new government in Brasilia is entering a new phase after this difficult time over the Iran issue. That issue, I'm sure, will be discussed in private, but the fact that the visit will focus on this broader range, I think, shows that the countries have found a way to move forward despite a fairly serious bump in the road last year. I believe that the President will address, hope he does address, a couple of issues that are of great interest to broader society. Again, Carolina will speak about the private sector, but all the issues surrounding foreign direct investment. There's a great paradox out there. Brazil is one of the top 5 countries in the world for foreign and direct investment, but if you look at the World Bank's indicators, the so-called doing business indicators, all the things about red tape and the ease of setting up a business or closing a business or getting credit. Brazil, in the latest of 2011 ranking, is 127th in the world. So there's a real paradox there of massive investment flows coming in, but some of the day-to-day difficulties of conducting business. So those are some of the issues I think that the private sector will be looking at. There is a private sector event on the 19th when the president is there. I have about 2 minutes, right? Another point that both Paolo and Luigi noted, the global nature of this relationship. This is a very key component of the U.S.-Brazil relationship. It's increasingly a component of the U.S.-Latin America relationship, and that's a good thing. I think it's very mistaken to look at U.S.-Latin America relations as bilateral. We have global issues in all of these countries, especially with Brazil. And part of that means that we need to talk about global issues with the Brazilians and other Latin countries, but it also means something else, which is even harder bureaucratically, and that is to talk to the rest of the world about Latin America and the Caribbean. As Alec knows and others know who have been in government, that bureaucratically can be difficult to get your colleagues in other regions of the other bureaus in the State Department to engage with China, with India, about Brazil, about Mexico, and so forth. It is not easy, but it's something we need to do a better job of. The Monroe Doctrine died long ago. The United States ought to welcome the increasing globalization of Brazil and the rest of the region. It's good for the United States, but we need to be able to talk about those issues in those terms. Finally, and I'll close here, the social changes. It's the first woman president of Brazil is going to be hosting the first African-American president of the United States, who will be accompanied by a woman Secretary of State who followed an African-American woman Secretary of State who followed an African-American male Secretary of State. There are profound changes in both societies. This visit reflects that. And I think that as we look at all the sort of issues on the table to be discussed, it's important to stand back and look at the social significance of what the two societies are achieving in trying to create greater social mobility. So with that, I thank you again, Paolo, for the invitation, and look forward to your questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ray. And now, from a view, Carl Meacham, and a lot of the issues that are on the table, for instance, Ambassador was talking, Carl, about the cooperation science, the whole ethanol issue. A lot of that depends on here in the United States, Congress. Some of the other issues mentioned also had great repercussion in Congress. So I thank you very much for coming here this morning and in your usual candidness, helping us understand what is realistic to think about the relationship from the perspective of the Capitol Hill. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Paolo, for this event. I mean, I think it's really timely to have this in the run-up to the President's trip. It's incredibly positive, I believe. But just looking around the room, this room should be full. It's not. That sort of, all the important players are here.
That's my fault.
No. all the important folks are here that cover Brazil and that have covered Brazil for a long time, and that's a great thing. It's great to be on a panel with people like Ambassador Einaudi and Craig Kelly and others. But I still don't have a feeling, at least in the U.S., that we've really grasped what this relationship should be and the attention we should be paying attention to Brazil. So I'm going to start with answering the question that you posed directly, which is, how does Congress see Brazil? I would say that I'm only one voice, but we pay very little attention to Brazil in the U.S. Congress. And I think things are improving, but despite the fact that we have this exceptional ambassador in Brazil with Tom Shannon, the legislative underpinnings of this relationship in broad terms are very modest and are focused mostly on the commercial side. We continue to struggle with these antiquated perceptions of Latin America and these, I would say, misguided expectations regarding to our relationship with Latin America, but with Brazil. I think the Ambassador Einaudi said Brazil is Brazil. It's true, Brazil is Brazil, but there's something about Brazil that's different within the region. I equate it a little bit more to what Australia is to South Asia. You know, it's sort of this exception in language, in culture, and in their ability to play a role in the world. So I would say that this is a government-wide problem. I see some of this in the executive branch as well. I mean, exempting the present company. But there are a lot of factors to explain this. I'm going to focus on the factors that make most sense in the legislative branch. So the first point is the context in which the U.S. is operating in the world has changed. But attitudes in the Congress have remained the same. Regardless of what we've seen with Brazil and the United States, regardless of where Brazil is, the United States and Europe are focused on their problems, their huge deficits, the threats to their recovery, and Brazil has been prospering. Not to say that Brazil hasn't had contact with the economic downturn, but in my view, it was one of the last in and one of the first out of this situation. Its economy is growing at a rate of 5%. It should pick up more speed over the next years as big new deep-sea oil fields come on stream, and as Asian countries are hungering for food and minerals from Brazil. Forecasts vary, but sometime in the decade after 2014, Brazil is likely to become the world's fifth largest economy, overtaking Britain and France. I would note that everything is not perfect in Brazil. I think Paulo mentioned a little earlier that...
Really?
Yes, yeah. I need to say this a lot because, you know, we can't be in these situations and just do all these glowing, maybe for the Itamaraty crowd that's right there all together. A glowing review always, but government spending is growing faster than the economy as a whole. Both private and public sectors still invest too little, and planting a question mark over these forecasts. Despite recent improvements in education, education and infrastructure still lag behind China's or South Korea's investments, and in some parts of Brazil, crime is still rampant. So these are issues that need to be addressed. But on the whole, Brazil is on the upswing, but the Congress is just becoming acquainted with it. The second big point, and I think, again, Ambassador Einaudi addressed some of these issues. Contrary to most governments in the region's desire to have close relations with the United States, we've seen Brazil traditionally exhibit a reluctance to expand relations with the United States. For members in Congress, this is a departure from the relationships that they've had with countries in the region. Brazil's independence on certain issues is new to a lot of folks in Congress as well. Over the final months of Lula's administration, and I review some of these issues as examples, Brazil and the United States often seem to be working at cross purposes. Brazilian actions on Iran's nuclear program and the constitutional crisis in Honduras, its sudden recognition of Palestine as an independent state, and other initiatives complicated U.S. efforts. In some cases, Brazilian actions help to create political space for those who explicitly reject the norms of international behavior and undermine the broader international system. So the rationale for several of these actions may primarily have been to gain commercial advantage or expand markets for Brazilian exports. That's a possibility. Or simply, they may have been a poor attempt to assume a leadership role on the global stage. Understanding Brazil's rationale could go far in explaining its public disinterest in the state of democracy in countries in the region, such as Venezuela and Cuba, as well as its outreach to Iran and the Arab states. On the other hand, such actions might also have been predicted of a nation that views its interests primarily as a brick or leader of the developing world. President Rousseff has an opportunity to define things differently from her predecessor, and some of that has already occurred. Ms. Rousseff has criticized repression in Iran, stressed her commitment to human rights, and said that she wants to deepen ties with the United States. And this amounts to a rebalancing of policy, in my view. But in the region, I think little has changed.
maintaining Marco Aurelio Garcia as sort of a foreign minister for the region has given us some pause, given his sympathy for folks like President Chavez and ex-President Zelaya. In the view of many in the Congress, this is not a good sign about the kind of leadership Brazil wants to exert in the region. And I say this with an understanding that the focus of this relationship should not be solely regional relations. We've already sort of passed the Rubicon there. We want to focus on these global issues, but I would sort of be ignoring a big chunk of what attitudes do exist in the Congress on this issue if I don't mention how Brazil is viewed in the region as well. So does the Congress care about relations with Brazil? I think so. I think most members would say yes. I think most members would say that this trip is a positive gesture and is consistent with American interests. So overall, I think the trip is positive. But I would add one caveat. It's clear that Brazil benefits from the visit. The leader of the free world, the first president of African American or African descent visits Brazil. That's a big deal. Whatever people's opinion of the president here at home, he is a figure that personifies much of what is great about both the United States and Brazil, their racial and ethnic diversity. The optic alone is impressive for Brazilians, and President Obama going to Brazil before the female president, or the first female president of Brazil, comes to Washington, boosts President Rousseff's status at home. But many members in the Congress are not happy with the president himself being the trip's deliverable. So besides the photo op, how will the United States benefit from this trip? It would be wonderful to work to advance a bilateral tax treaty, or if the president or if this trip served to start negotiations of a market access agreement to Mercosur, or even better yet, if this trip could be the last nudge to ensure that Brazil purchases 36 fighter jets worth billions from the United States and not from France or Sweden. These items are all very important. So in my opinion, and we talked about all the dialogues, I think there's 15 dialogues that we have. So these things are happening. The executive to executive branch relationship of the government is vibrant, and that's very clear. But it seems, in my opinion, that this relationship could also benefit from that big agreement, that big, legal, long-lasting framework ratified by both Congresses to set this relationship in stone, regardless of who's president in the United States and regardless of what party is the majority in the U.S. Congress. I already see my friends from Itamaraty laughing, but in reaction to my frustration on this issue, I've spoken to lots of folks in the government, and I've said, can't we do more? And they say, maybe what we have now is just good enough. Perhaps. Perhaps it is. Maybe our expectations for this relationship should be lower, realistically speaking, for the short term. Nevertheless, President Obama's trip serves as an opportunity to take stock of where this relationship is since the last visit by a U.S. president, by President Bush in March of 2007. In closing, it's clear that Brazil's progress and the global context require an updated U.S. policy towards a country in transition from South American power to major global player. But I think that I speak for most of folks in Congress when I remind you that Brazil must also recognize that its own ascent in the New World does not imply a change in global systems or the role that the U.S. plays in them. So I think the focus should be trying to work together. I think our focus should be in our mutual interest. And with that, I conclude my remarks.
Thank you very much, Carl. Well, we'll now hear from Luis Bittencourt, who has worked in strategic affairs and defense issues, both in Brazil and here. Luis, as Brazil Armed Forces embarks in a very important program for re-equipment, which is absolutely necessary in Brazil. And in a context where Brazil rises, or Brazil becomes increasingly more influential economically, especially vis-à-vis its neighbors. Obviously, it's quite a quite an interesting process, this one that we have. Brazil to assert not only its power, its leadership, and what Brazil does in terms of cooperation, defense cooperation with its neighbors and with the United States. Is a very important part of this process, so I would like us to like you to enlighten us about this area.
How much time I have?
About 12 minutes. I know you can do it.
Good morning, you all. I have to start with a disclaimer that whatever I say here does not represent my institution or the U.S. government. Of course, we do have academic freedom, and this is what I'm using to say some things, to bring to your attention some ideas. I also have to correct something that the goodwill of Paulo put in my presentation. I am a dean in the context of National Defense University, but I have a particular component of the university, which is the Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies. So we deal with the hemisphere. And the National Defense University is a broader institution, is a bigger institution. I may be dean there one day. I'm already starting using bow ties some days.
That's the idea. We are already, preparing the way.
I have the sensation that what I'm going to bring here it's a good segue, particularly to what Carl was mentioning, and then also to just to Paulo mentioned to you. My impression is that I'm talking about the 800-pound gorilla who is not in the room, the security issue or the defense issue, because traditionally we don't like to speak about those things in Brazil. I remember that when Rubens Barbosa was the Brazilian ambassador here, and I proposed to organize a panel, because we did have some interest in the U.S. side, a panel on defense relationship. Barbosa was immediately opposed to that. Said, no way. I mean, I don't want to discuss that. But we are interested in discuss trade in general preferences. Security is not an issue for us. And he was right. Security was not an issue for Brazil. But then I told him, look, Rubens, if you don't talk about security and defense with Americans, you are probably obliterating 90% of the American brain, because they are concerned with that. This is part of the deal. If you sit down and discuss that, perhaps then you can introduce some other topics, such as trade and other topics of interest. I could not convince him, but anyway, this was. So what I want to bring to you today is I want to make the case that we are indeed in a different strategic moment. But I have some serious doubts about when people in the administration of countries, in governments, when they do realize that the strategic moment has changed. And if they realize when they can start moving along with new paradigms. My impression is that we indeed perceive that some things have changed. This is, for example, part of the U.S. national security strategy. When President Obama introduces that, the first thing that he notices is the change in the strategic environment because of globalization, because of the tremendous change in the environment. However, my sensation is that our mindsets, in particular when we are in the government schemes, we take a while to change. Many times our discourse changes, but until this reflects into action, real action, it takes a long time. And this takes a long time here and takes a long time in Brazil and wherever. So this affects basically the relationship of defense, which is the topic I'm bringing to you. I see the topics of, or this big topic, defense relationship between Brazil and the U.S., divide in perhaps three clearly distinct phases. I recovered, just because of curiosity, something that I collected last year from the National Archives. It's so-called the Rubber Plan. It's a document from December 1941. In this document, the U.S. Marines are preparing to invade Amazonia. This is a real document. I'm not talking about the monthly meetings at the Clube Militar of Rio de Janeiro, in which they say that America's... No, this is a real document. 1941. I shared this document with some visitors from the Brazilian Naval Staff School. And I asked them, what do you think of that? To my surprise, they said, this is the natural reaction of a country perceiving its interests endangered. And the strategic interests of the United States were, in those days, in the Amazon mouth, because of the rubber trees, because of all the shipments. So rubber was a strategic issue for the U.S. And it was so important that because we did have some sympathy of Getúlio Vargas, who was a dictator in Brazil, towards the Hitler, the Nazi regime, the other dictators in the European who were doing so well. Remember that Hitler was cover at the Times magazine in 1938. There was in those days a young lieutenant, a Brazilian lieutenant called Roberto de Pessoa, who died last year, retired general, after completing 100 years old. Was considered the first Brazilian parachutist. And he was, in 1936, delighted, amazed, and taking pictures in his own camera. It should be a big camera. They didn't have this small camera in those days. But was taking pictures from Hitler opening the Olympic Games in Berlin. And the world was amazed. Well, we know where this ended in. But it was clear that Brazil in those days was ambivalent between being allied to the Allied efforts when the war started or closer to the ex-countries, after all. The decision, it's a model of diplomacy. I'm not quite sure whether those plans were for real, because there is one item here in the plans which it's very interesting. It authorizes the plans to go through normal mail because of the urgency of this situation. Although they were secret documents, they were authorized to go to normal mail. Was this made on purpose, perhaps to come to the hands of the Brazilians, and then make the Brazilians think, whoops, this is too serious? On the Brazilian side, we have to recognize that Getúlio Vargas was playing very well with the U.S. interests in the region and trying to, if we go with Americans, we have to increase our gains in this negotiation. Of course, there is a point of equilibrium in that, and then he was playing with that. For the same reason, the U.S. sent to Brazil Orson Welles to shoot a movie, and this is probably should have received an Oscar if, just to remember yesterday night. But Orson Welles was drunk for most of the time and never finished the movie, and he fell in love for Brazil and the Brazilian women. And at one point, they had to cancel the contract.
What can I imagine?
As a result of those actions, the first phase of the U.S.-Brazil defense relations was initiated in 1942. Representation was created in Washington, representation was created in Brazil. As a result of that, many equipment was transferred to Brazil. As a result of that, Brazil decided to send a division to fight in Italy. 25,000 troops to fight in Italy. They were trained, they were equipped by the Americans, and they fought in Italy. And some 2,000 of them died in that conflict. After the end of the war, Brazil was willing to have some recognition for this. And Brazil got something else in addition to that. For example, the steel mill Volta Redonda came as an exchange for this participation. But Brazil expected from America more recognition, which did not come. And this created, I think, the first negative perception from the Brazilian side that Americans are really not up to the commitments that they make. When the interests fade, also the commitments fade. But anyway, this was the first phase of the relationship. And then we have the second phase, which goes along with the Cold War. In that phase, Brazil was receiving equipment, was receiving material, was receiving training, and was becoming, Brazilian military were increasingly being trained to face counterinsurgency and communism and counter-subversion and all those things. So this was very influential in the relationship with Brazil. In 1949, we have the creation of Brazilian War College, ESG, with the American help. And then we have this was when it was beginning to build the Brazilian thinking, military thinking, a new military thinking. And then, as probably you know, this went until 1977. Was then, because of the attacks that, or critical, or not the real attacks, but the opinion public here against the way the Brazilian military regime was dealing with human rights and those things, many criticisms here. And also because Brazil perceived that all the military equipment they were received were really old military equipment, they decided to break the agreement. So this closes the second phase of the relationship. We are right now in the beginning of a new relationship. Last year, we had very productive meetings in the U.S.-Brazil bilateral conversations between experts from both sides, very productive meetings. This resulted in a new agreement. So we are in the beginning of a new phase. And the new agreement, if you read that, is very generic, as you would expect. But it's clear there, for example, Brazilians are very interested in learning more about the cybersecurity. They are very interested in keeping the nuclear options open, but not the nuclear weapon option. They want to have the ability to keep doing their nuclear programs, and at this point to use a nuclear-powered submarine. It's not for the nuclear weapons, because as you know, Brazil really forgo this and gave up of this program in the 90s. And then the space program, which is another dream of Brazil. And this is what then came into the negotiation. But if you look at the summary of the current agreement, you will see that there is a promise there for cooperation in research and development, logistics support, technology security and acquisition. Almost every agreement deals with that. And then there is a promise for information exchanges, operational experiences, defense technologies, and peacekeeping operations. One thing that worked quite well was in the aftermath of the earthquake in Haiti, Brazil and the U.S. cooperated tremendously well, and this was fantastic. Unfortunately, this was not fruit of an agreement, was not fruit in any decision, was because the two commanders, the Southcom commander, General Ken, and the Brazilian commander of MINUSTAH, General Floriano Peixoto, they had been colleagues before in the staff school. So it was just natural for them to use the phone call and resolve any difference that they could have, and this produced a tremendous cooperation. Serendipitously, we were there. But this was not because of an agreement. But now this is coming to feed the agreement. So this is good news. And also the promise to collaboration, military systems and equipment. And finally, exchange of instructors, naval ships, visitors, and commercial. Nothing really very new here. What is clear to perceive is that both sides are approaching the topic very carefully. Brazil, as usual, trying to maintain open all the options. And the U.S., as usual, trying to maintain his view of the problem. And this is something that we must understand. Traditionally, the U.S. deals with enemies, allies, or partners on which it has the hand. I mean, I give you equipment, I give you the aid, and then you act in the way we want you to act. Well, Brazil is trying to pursue a different venue. Brazil does not want to be an enemy, of course. Brazil does not want to be an allied. Brazil wants to be a partner, but being treated in equal circumstances. Now, is it possible? This is a big challenge. For example, if you look at the Brazilian National Strategy of Defense, the first words are, we hereby submit to the highest consideration the attached proposal, and then, as usual, and then the first statement is that Brazil is a peaceful country by tradition and conviction. It lives in peace with its neighbors, It runs its international affairs, among other things, adopting the constitutional principles of non-intervention, defense of peace, and peaceful resolution of conflicts. This pacifist trait is, to maintain this, is very cherished in Brazil. Is it possible to join defense alliances based exclusively on this soft power notion, or this is a bridge too far? This is a big challenge. So we have the two major partners, very interested in cooperation, new agreement, new phase. But as I said in the beginning, I don't see yet that the mindsets in both sides have changed enough to deal with this different moment. And we are indeed in a different moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. Well, I'd like to invite now Carolina Costa to speak about one side that we talk about a lot, which is the business interactions. There are thousands of American companies in Brazil. The United States remains the single largest investor country in Brazil. There are a growing number of Brazilian companies now in the United States. It has, I think, created a new dynamic, a new interest on business community of both countries, and a lot of potential and a lot of obstacles also to make this relationship more fluid. And it's a pleasure to be able to have Carolina Costa here from the McLarty company to talk to us about what are the challenges from the perspective of someone that deals with those things on a daily basis, with companies that want things to happen in Brazil and want things to happen in the United States to facilitate business. Thank you very much, Carol.
Well, thank you, Paulo, for hosting the event, for inviting me. Thank you, fellow speakers, and thank you to the audience. I will be brief. I don't want to be repeating a lot that has been said already in this great panel. But, just to start, on the last 2 years of Lula's administration, everyone was aware of the notable differences between Obama's and Lula's administration. Brazil and the U.S. disagree on the way to handle Iran. The Washington willingness to accept election results in Honduras was not welcomed by Brazil, and etc. Yet, despite the politically troubled relationship, businesses between the two countries continue to flourish. The U.S. remained the largest single foreign investor in Brazil, as Paulo mentioned, taking advantage of Brazil's decade-long economic stability and continuous growth rates. And Brazilians, taking advantage of a cheap dollar, are shopping around in the United States like never before. Brazilians are now walking around rural Colorado and in St. Louis, since JBS and Ambev are investing heavily in these communities. Embraer produces planes in Nashville and Florida. Burgers now come with a Brazilian flavor with the acquisition of Burger King by 3G Capital. And our Brazilian supermodels are marrying the U.S. sports stars. By the way, I am not that supermodel, and my husband is not the sports star. Wish he was. I'm sure he wish he was. I was Gisele too. So, but in this context of a previous politically troubled agenda, but a flourishing business relationship, I believe that President Obama's upcoming trip to Brazil could have serve a twofold purpose. The first one, it reveals that Washington has gotten the message that Brasilia wants to recalibrate its political relationship with the U.S. Despite Dilma's affinity to Lula, she has indeed taken careful steps to highlight her administration's willingness to work with the United States. Thus, from a political perspective, this is an important opportunity for Brazil and the U.S. to continue deepening the bilateral relationship at its highest level. Secondarily, it is an opportunity for businesses of both sides to boost its business relationships. The the private sector has to capitalize on the energy, buzz, and momentum that the visit will for sure generate to take advantage of extensive business opportunities resulting mostly from Brazil's rapidly growing economy, planned infrastructure growth, and investments in some key sectors, such as energy and infrastructure for the 2014 World Cup and 2016 Summer Olympics. And the Brazilian private sector also has to take advantage of these very same opportunities. But what's really important too is that the visit is used as an opportunity for the private sector to voice their concerns. For instance, protectionist barriers that hinder a firmer integration between Brazil and the U.S. should for sure be addressed. Also, Brazilian exporters and foreign investors all agreed that the Brazil cost, led by inefficient and costly infrastructure, sluggish bureaucracy, high taxes, and an archaic labor code, also must be addressed. So I just want to end with one question to us here and to the audience. That I wonder as you read about the visit and again the buzz and momentum that this will generate and the importance that Obama is traveling to Brazil to meet with our new president. Will this improved political relationship that is now happening between Brazil and the U.S. is likely to result in greater levels of trade and investment? I think we all agree on that. And these greater levels of trade and investment will invariably continue to bring Brazil into the world stage. But the question is, could this new engine for growth and trade help push for the much-needed internal reforms Brazil must endure if it truly wants to join the global stage? Could these external forces, this greater closeness in the bilateral relationship, have enough power to force the Brazilian society to take a hard look into what's hindering Brazil and its competitiveness? Crumbling infrastructure, archaic labor code, complex and burdensome tax system, bureaucracy, and red tape. And on the other hand, could these external forces help raise the profile of Brazil with the U.S. Congress here in the United States, who are the gatekeepers of many tools that are crucial, that are very crucial and fundamental to lead to greater investment and trade between the two countries? I'm an optimistic by nature. I'm Brazilian, we all are. And in my view, I do believe that the momentum and energy created by the Obama visit will bring these changes. So we just have to stay tuned and continue to work for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Well, before opening for questions, I just wanted to notice that here at the Wilson Center, we are mourning the passing of Mr. Joseph Flom, former chairman of the Board of Trustees. That is actually, this room is named after him. He was instrumental in bringing the Wilson Center from its old digs at the castle, the Smithsonian Castle, to this location about 12 years ago. He passed away just this weekend, and we wanted to. I think this is one of the first events, or the first event after Mr. Flom's passing in the room that named after him. So I wanted to share that with you. And at the end of the program, we will have another passage, but that will be a very happy one. With that, I would like to invite you for your questions. Please identify yourselves. Be brief, be sharp, be tough, because they can take it. Yes.
Winston Wilkinson. I'm a student at Johns Hopkins SAIS. I actually just returned from Brazil last week. I was there for 5 weeks and spoke to a range of people from taxi drivers to CEOs. And the common theme was that they, like Obama seems to be very popular, but Dilma is popular, but people are kind of unsure about her. They don't know her well. And so to that point, how will this visit help Dilma to kind of establish herself and make her more of a, not accepted, but kind of solidify her leadership? Then the second question relates to the timing of the visit. Obviously, when Obama went to India and Korea back in the fall, there was a lot of news about it was to encourage commercial relationships. I'm not sure if this visit is carrying the same weight. And to that point, can you talk about why not? And then also maybe talk about a little bit about the timing in terms of the agreement. There won't be an agreement with the U.S. At least the Congress won't pass an trade agreement with Colombia and Panama before this visit. And maybe talk about how that might impact what can get done on the trade front.
Who wants to go first? Any takers?
On Gilma status, Luigi, you want to take that one?
Let me start saying something here just on that. But, whoops, what is it? The Dilma being, no, you used the word Dilma being accepted. Well, actually, 57 million Brazilians have already decided that part. She's very accepted. And I think personally, yes, President Dilma does not have sort of the world the reputation that President Lula or even his predecessor, President Cardoso, had as a leader. She is a person that has contributed a lot, but working basically on domestic policy. I think in that sense, this visit by President Obama and other engagements she will have certainly will help to build up in the eyes of the Brazilian society, in the eyes of foreigners, the role that obviously President Dilma is already playing, is bound to keep playing, which is to be president of Brazil. But what illustrates, what gives content to that, I think, is the fact that she is president of Brazil. That to a large extent, she built from that. It's challenging because she doesn't have not shown yet the natural abilities of a charismatic leader, etc. But in a sense, it makes even more challenging, more interesting, because she has to depend on the charisma of the country, on the strengths of the country. And but in that sense, I believe that the trip helps a lot, because obviously receiving President Obama and producing having a good meeting, open new doors in Brazil-U.S. relations adds a very important dimension to the bilateral relationship.
And I think it also works both ways. It helps President Obama. Whenever a president undertakes a major visit overseas, that president gets a bit of a bounce and approval in the United States, assuming the visit goes well, which I'm sure this one will. In terms of the commercial aspects, as some of us touched on, there are, nothing is inevitable about any country's economic rise. And just as Brazil is booming, there are, as Carolina noted, there are challenges out there. And there are challenges that affect U.S. investors, and that is why it is important, behind closed doors for the two teams to talk about some of those issues, because there are bumps in the road in the U.S.-Brazil economic relationship that I think can be flattened for the benefit of both countries.
As far as the last point I think you touched on, which had to do with Colombia, we can't ignore that. For us, it's a huge omission that he's going to go to South America and not stop by in Colombia, where we've invested more than $7 billion over, I think, 10 years or more. And the timing of the trip to Brazil, as it relates to the free trade agreement with Colombia and Panama, is super important, because the only time that this free trade agreement is going to occur, it's more likely to occur, is this year. So this push for the president, if the president really is concerned and really is interested in pushing these trade agreements, this is the time to have made that stopover in Colombia. I know that this isn't a panel on on Colombia, but we need to address that issue, and we are concerned.
Cindy, Cindy Arson. She's the director of the Latin American program here at the Wilson Center.
Well, thanks. I have a follow-up question for Carl. There's a lot of talk, obviously, about cooperation in biofuels and in new technologies, but there's a sort of a concrete problem in the Congress, which are, the high levels of tariffs against the import of Brazilian ethanol and the sort of related subsidies to domestic producers of corn ethanol. And I was wondering if you foresee any change in the attitude of the Congress, either as a result of the trip or just a change in the dynamic around barriers to certain Brazilian products coming in.
That's a great question. I think it's important to look at it within the context of our economic situation. We face a lot of challenges in dealing with lowering tariffs and advancing free trade agreements when the economy is poor in the United States. There's a lot there with the fact that we need to be able to persuade folks to understand that more commerce, more trade actually translates into more jobs. And I don't think we've done such a good job in promoting that. People's attitudes when they're out of work, when they see that we're facilitating, in their view, facilitating for other countries to do business, is that they're losing their jobs as a result of those relationships. So, and that's, in my view, I think it's not accurate, but that's how they would look at it. As far as what bounce we will see from this trip in that regard, I don't think that you will see a direct one. I think that there's a lot of people in places like Iowa and Indiana that are watching this closely. My boss, for one, is interested in figuring out what the right approach is to lower this tariff and this tax that we have on Brazilian ethanol. I think the Brazilians would tell you, firstly, they'd say, well, we don't have enough stuff to sell yet. So it's something that focuses on many factors. It's not just the one factor about lowering the tariffs. And the last thing that I would say is I think that the Brazilian ambassador has done a good job of starting to, I know that Ambassador Patriota used to do this as well in Abdenur, where they're going to states and sort of dealing with that issue of the Brazilian boogeyman, that the Brazilians are going to come here and take your ethanol, or if we open up the market to the Brazilians, it's going to mean that Americans are going to suffer as a result. Well, I think that these relationships by the ambassadors with the governors in those states will go a long way in sort of fostering a better relationship, one that Brazilians will appreciate and where American producers won't feel threatened.
Yeah, your question, though, I think very usefully shows that there are concerns on the Brazilian side about the U.S. economy, not just about U.S. businesses in Brazil, and also the passage of a Buy Brazil Act. Well, we all know that there's been a Buy America Act for a long time as well, and so there is always the risk of protectionism in the relationship.
Yeah, but Carl, one thing, it looks like the support in the United States for the ethanol protection, not the protection, the subsidies, the tax credit, in an economy that is really facing this big fiscal situation, seems to be going down, right? The question is more on the barriers, the tariff, rather than the support. It looks like the support subsidies is sort of losing ground.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a process. I mean, I think we're starting to see that. 2 years ago, there wasn't that kind of support. So I think there's a softening, but there's still a lot of work to be done.
Okay. Questions? Yes, gentleman there, Michael. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Steve Landy, Manchester Trade. We do miss you in the journalistic communities, but perhaps you're now in the academic intellectual community. Again, I don't know why we're focusing so much on economics and not more on security, although I think my view is security, we're sorry, you're not going to make it. It's not a major issue. We're happy you guys are working on it, but economics is really where the future is. And something has happened very significantly just last week that got very little attention. But as you know, there's increased concern about how is the U.S. going to compete against China in the world economy. And Exim Bank announced this new facility that they were creating where U.S. and Brazilian exporters can work together in terms of accessing credit, particularly in Africa, which is such a challenging area and so on. And the question I really wanted to direct was more at Brazil as a member of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, whatever the other ones are, Brazil, Russia, India, and China economies, which is one area where they do have a focus on their policy, and the other area which is closer relationships with the U.S. We see this division particularly in the Doha round of trade negotiations, but in other areas as well. So how do you think Brazil is going to balance their interest of being a leading emerging economy with this new interest in working together with the U.S.? Quick comment on ethanol. Again, another issue we shouldn't even, it's not worth talking about when we talk about important issues, because number one, it is clear that Congress is not going to renew the subsidy for ethanol, and with that you lose the excuse for the duty, and I think they kind of solve each other, because the actual duty on ethanol is, I mean, I want to say 3%, but it's very low. So I think that problem is well on the way to resolution. And one credit for the Obama administration is it has emphasized doubling of exports. It's accepted now that imports do not take away jobs, and the amount of protectionism that the U.S. has experienced recently has been minimal compared to past experience, particularly during the Reagan administration, which I served in. Thank you.
Yeah, let me start by suggesting that you read the inaugural speech, I believe, by the new Foreign Minister, Patriot, is at the Foreign Minister's site. It's there in English. It's very interesting because there seems to be, it's clearly, there is a rebalancing on Brazil's position in the world, and the minister says very clearly Brazil is going to continue to pursue the new formats, the new types of engagement, but he says specifically not to the detriment of the relationships with the developed world. And this is, I think, is a very important nuance, and that's what, in my view, what guides that. If you look to what President Dilma Rousseff has announced are her priorities, Brazil will need, in the foreseeable future, in the next 10 years, something in the order of $500 billion to $1 trillion of direct foreign investment. And I think that the concern is to keep the country moving, and that the messages that the country projects and the interactions that the country has reinforces that main objective. I think that has a lot to do with the repositioning vis-à-vis the United States. There is pragmatism is our second name in Brazil, so it's our other name. Brazilians are very practical, like Americans are, or at least used to be, until some very strange things started happening here. But this is, I think, as far as Brazil engagement in those other formats. Who wants to, Luigi? You.
I'm going to say the same thing Paolo said. In a slightly different set of words. My sense is that Brazil is clearly going to move, has already started to move in the direction of a rebalancing. Defined this way, it has had two extraordinary male presidents in succession who have been able to sell a charismatic vision of Brazil through their own personal capacity. They've handed power now to a woman who, because she is a woman, is inevitably looked at with some of the skepticism that we heard in the opening question, and who has inherited a system that has overstretched. I mean, there can be no doubt that Brazil's, my mother used to say of my brother, but your eyes are bigger than your stomach. Don't eat so much. Well, they've opened too many embassies in too many places. Maybe not. Maybe it's the right number. I am certainly not going to judge from the outside, but they've certainly stretched themselves. They were dealing with a United States that was symbolized negatively by the war in Iraq and the second Bush presidency. That's gone. I mean, Iraq is not gone, but but the U.S. as a flouter of the Security Council is gone. The reorientation of the U.S. to a more open situation is gone. So it's easier to rebalance. Now, clearly, you can't rebalance. It would be foolish to think that Brazil would abandon its BRIC posture, its South-South ties. It is South. It is, in spite of all of our niceties here, and we say, it's not clear that the U.S. really welcomes Brazil fully in every way. I was terrified, excuse me, Luis, much as I love you, by your bringing up a 1941 marine invasion plan of the Amazon. Are you sure it was 1941? Can it be 1991? Will it be 2021? There is inevitably an American sense that we ought to protect our interests and control the world, and a Brazilian sense that that's exactly what we're going to try to do and that they have to defend themselves against us. If that sense gets too strong, then you don't rebalance. And I think that what is happening now is there is an opportunity for rebalancing because we seem, and I think are, genuinely, both ideologically and pragmatically, in a non-aggressive period. And it is also clear that cooperation with the U.S. can provide things for Brazil that Brazil needs. And so that has to work. What scares me about the future is, and Carl was really very good about it, because he reminded us that our country, the United States, is rooted in its own problems and its own representations and its own political movements, and that to sell things and to do those things that Brazil needs from us may require a little bit more political leadership and openness than our economy is going to give us right now, and our mental perceptions will give us. But let us hope. I am confident that Brazil is going to move in a positive direction, and that the silly hubris, posturing anti-Americanism that showed through some of these last years is a passing phase.
Just a compliment still on that speech by Ambassador Patriota, the inaugural speech of his as foreign minister. He also mentioned the issue of consolidation, meaning I think Brazil opened lots of positions abroad, embassies, etc. It started important work on international cooperation, which is relatively, well, it's new for Brazil, and it's a matter now of staffing those positions and preparing to do the real work. So, again, to make reference to that inaugural speech by Foreign Minister Patriota.
Well,
yes, let's go there.
Well, just a quick point. I think that the question about the relationship with the other BRICS is a very good one. Already, 61% of Brazil's trade is with countries that are not in Europe or the United States. So there is a very heavy South-South emerging market to emerging market, or as Tom Shannon would say, emerged market in the case of Brazil. President Lula traveled to 67 developing countries. Clearly, those two facts are related. A lot of this was commercial. Some of it was foreign policy initiatives that I suspect the current president will not follow up on. But I suspect there will be a strong South-South focus that follows the commercial patterns, the trade patterns.
I want to make a comment before. You know, I don't have a microphone. This is the way Paulo is.
No, he's from.
He's blocking my word here. So,
as we say here, ele é de casa. So
he also took out my glass of water. So I'm also denied to have water, as you notice.
We don't believe in security.
I'm just kidding. I just want to use Luis's point to underscore my main tag here, which is the following. We have changed a lot over the last few years and over the last half century. But many of us, and sometimes people in the administration, did not perceive how much we have changed. That's why I use that old example of one plan as to create the contrast in perspective. I do think it's very important to remember those things, to see how much we have changed, and then take into consideration those changes and act accordingly. And another point that I would like to tie really to the first question and one of the other questions is that when you mentioned about the possible implication or impact of President Obama's visit, there's always impact. There's always popular impact. There's always a sense of admiration to the U.S. example, to the U.S. model. It's perhaps not so spread out as we think that it is, but there's always this impact. I remember of President Clinton's visit. People were delighted because he was in a favela kicking a soccer ball. This was the most important image of his visit for the popular consumption. But this has nothing to do with the accomplishments, real accomplishments that the visit can do in the bilateral agenda. And this is what is critically important right now, I believe. A visit can just accomplish as much as the visit is. There's really symbolic effect in that. And in this case, for example, it was mentioned before, well, I hope that Lula would announce support that Obama would announce support to Brazil's intention to have a seat in the Security Council. That's all right. It may or may not. But it's interesting that this is a case that I do believe that Brazilians might make yet for the Brazilian society. It's a good case in the leadership that, yes, Brazil should have that. Brazilian people have no clue on that. This is not an issue for the Brazilian population. What really having a seat in the Security Council we have for Brazilian people? They have no clue. They're quite interested in what they have, what they had in the Lula administration, the Bolsa Familia, all this coming to participate in the economy. This was phenomenal. Strategic interests of Brazil are not, and perhaps they shouldn't, be in the domain of the population. But sometimes we have to remember that it's important. If we do want to accomplish such a goal, we have also to educate our own people on why we are doing that. And I don't think this was it was an issue well discussed or well informed to the population. Why Brazil need to have, and after that, what kind of responsibilities come with the position? Because there are responsibilities that will come with that.
Question? Paul.
Yes. Thank you. My name is Paul Johnson. I'm the Honorary Consul of Brazil in Philadelphia. I think there's two questions or two topics that I had. One is for the entire panel. I didn't hear any mention of the discussed joint efforts from the United States and Brazil to work together on the issue of currency revaluation with China. I'd like to hear some comment on that. And secondly, with respect to the dynamics within the U.S. Congress with respect to a higher profile in Brazil, and Carl, you had mentioned, anecdotally that this room should be filled, and that there should be, greater attention paid to this relationship. What I'm trying to understand is the reason why, for example, this room is not filled, is it because of some of the perceptions of geopolitics being at cross purposes, or is it rather the United States feeling comfortable with the ascent of Brazil and trying to take its place in that capacity? And I think my last comment with respect to that is the new composition of Congress with a lot of Republicans coming in, this Tea Party movement and the like. How is that going to affect the perception within the Congress of Brazil, coming into their place in the world? Thank you.
Carl.
Sure. On your first question, I think Secretary Geithner was pretty clear in a statement that he gave during, I think, the last 2 weeks about conversations with the Brazilians and with his Brazilian counterpart to address that issue of reserve currency. Our position here in the United States is the dollar should be the reserve currency. It's very clear. It's very clear how that benefits us with regards to oil, with regards to other products, with regards to our role in multilateral lending organizations. So we have a very clear view on that. I think the Brazilians are sort of peeved with the Chinese on their undervalued currency, and we in the United States are also concerned with regard to that. So that's the first issue. As far as Brazil and Congress, we have in the House a Brazil caucus, and we have a lot of folks that are interested in Brazil issues. I'd say my boss, Senator Lugar, is probably the most interested in Brazil and in Brazil issues and the rise of Brazil and the role it can play for the United States, as well as Brazil in its own right in the Senate. We need more of that. But the way that Congress works in general is you have most members reacting to events. I work for a member that's a little different, that gets ahead of events and defines them. Many people in Congress are still reacting to Brazil's involvement with regards to Iran and the Security Council. And that's just widespread. So I believe that the president, besides just going to Brazil now, needs to come back and clarify misperceptions, needs to explain his views on this trip. The secretary or the relevant interlocutor from state needs to come and talk about these things. I also think it's important that the Brazilians work out their own strategy to deal with some of these issues and correct misperceptions as they see them. So I think that would be complementary. I would just mention another thing is the Brazilians, we during President Lula's terms, we invited President Lula to the Congress 4 times. He never came once. So there also has to be, from the Brazilian side, an understanding of what role the Congress plays and how it's consistent with some of their interests. We need to see that. And last, your question on the different Congress, the role of new membership and the Tea Party, we really haven't seen much insofar as a definition of interests from Tea Party members with regards to foreign policy. You hear a lot of folks like Ron Paul, for instance, talking about a more isolationist approach to our role in the world. I work for Senator Lugar. He's an internationalist. It's sort of mixing water and oil. It's not consistent with the role and the view that we have of our place in the world. As far as Tea Party folks, I think you're going to have to ask them. I'm not a spokesperson for them. But you are correct in assuming that there will be an impact given the new members that are coming in once they figure out what their role, what their views are of not just the relationship with Brazil, but other countries around the world. There will be a different impact, and it will be felt. And that's just the course of our political how would you say, our process and how it works.
Paul, 2 things on trips. First, the impact of trips. I remember the President Clinton's trip in 1997. President Clinton was the last American president that visited Brazil and could go to publicly, and he went to Mangueira, actually. It was quite an impressive thing. Just before he went, there were some very I believe at the time both ambassadors, the U.S. ambassador there and the Brazilian ambassador here, not always had the best interest of the relationship in mind. I was not very popular with either because of the things I wrote highlighting that. But President Clinton arrived in Brazil. Veja magazine had a cover by the name, and Elsa remembers that. The name was, there's a Clinton, in a very arrogant pose, and the title of the cover was The Arrogance of the Empire. Clinton turned that perception around in about 12 hours with engagement, with showing, and then with going to Rio, going to São Paulo. And I think that this trip, although I don't think there is this sort of antagonism right now, I think President Obama may provoke the same sort of positive reaction, and this becomes a new information that the Brazilian government has to deal with. And I believe, like Donna Reinach and others, that yes, there is anti-Americanism in Brazil. It's very shallow. It's maybe a mile long, but an inch deep. I think the country, Brazilians generally like American society. The second thing about currency, if quantitative easing has been very much criticized in Brazil by the Minister of Finance and by many others, as obviously the Chinese currency policy also. If quantitative easing produces its results, the desired result is to help to stimulate the U.S. economy. If that happens, this sort of sin will be forgiven and will be forgotten, because what Brazil needs is a thriving, growing U.S. economy. On the Chinese, there is a more structural issue, because the currency policy of the Chinese, it really hurts Brazil, dislocates Brazilian exports here in the Americas, and it's a very serious issue. Although, and that one, it's very difficult to deal ideologically with currency. You have, and the government is under pressure there, but I believe that if and when quantitative easing ends, having produced the result, that's important, I think you will see Brazil's interest more closer to the American interest as far as dealing with the currency issue, and this will take place at the G20. Questions? One there in the back. Oh, and then Leslie. Okay.
I'm Major Gil Raboni. I work for the Undersecretary of the Air Force for International Affairs, and Brazil is one of the countries that I deal with. My question simply is, a couple of weeks ago, Undersecretary Valenzuela and Deputy Assistant Secretary Moore, speaking in front of a congressional committee, said two things that kind of speak to what's going on here. That with regards to the FX2 project, there shouldn't be any doubt on the part of Brazil of technological transfers that will allow them to have that main thing that seems to bind all of their contractual military things, technological transfer. Secondly, the other statement that kind of seems to contradict what's been said here today is Secretary Venezuela said that they would put, this transfer would put Brazil at a parity with other top U.S. allies. And I think that the congressional misgivings that I'm hearing seem to point in the direction these statements continually need to be said, because we're still not at the point that we're feeling very comfortable that we're going to have the ability to do these things and put Brazil in that place where they can see, yes, we want the technological transfer, and yes, we want that high level of cooperation that the DCA that we just signed with them seems to indicate we want.
Yeah, let me get Leslie's question, and then we'll have a final round. Leslie Bethel is a senior scholar at the Brazil Institute here at the Wilson Center.
Thank you, Paulo. I think, in fact, I wanted to ask exactly what has just been asked by the last questioner. Obviously, we, at a meeting like this, we're looking to be optimistic about the possibilities for a new relationship between Brazil and the United States, and we're optimistic about the effect of the Obama visit. But as a Brit living in Brazil and spending a lot of time in Washington, I am constantly impressed at the lack of knowledge, the lack of awareness, somewhat irritation, frustration with Brazil that is seen around this town and in the United States generally, but also, of course, in Brazil, the lack of knowledge, the lack of awareness of the United States, and in the last administration, clearly an underlying anti-Americanism that comes from the left in the 1960s and 1970s. But if Brazil is clearly, of all the major countries in the world and the major countries that aspire to become great nations in the world, Brazil probably has the most soft power and the least hard power. One of the projects clearly in Brazil now is to modernize and strengthen Brazil's armed forces, the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. We've seen this. And I just wanted to ask a question. now been touched upon, and mainly of Luis perhaps. In terms of a new relationship, looking to the future, between Brazil and the United States, how important is it that Brazil buys its 36 fighters that will eventually become 115, whatever it is? How important is it to the US-Brazil relationship that Brazil should now drop the French, abandon the Swedes and the British, they've already dropped the Russians, and buy US fighter planes?
Luis, this is in the muy amigo category question, so all yours.
Quite interesting. Let me start by saying that one thing that I know is that we don't know everything that is going on in the negotiations. This is very hard to know. I was for some years working in the, what was the name of this? Secretary for Strategic Affairs in Brazil. And in those days we were dealing with a competition that was smaller than this one, but it was to define the company that would provide the CIVAN system for the vigilance of Amazonia. Was $1.7 billion. The pressures that we perceived that were such magnitude that at one point my boss was the retired Admiral Flores. He decided to transfer the competition to the Navy because he could not deal anymore with the pressure that he was feeling inside of the presidential palace because of all interests going and coming in, which resulted in one Minister of the Air Force, Brazilian Minister of the Air Force, being fired, and resulted in one diplomat being forced to, was put in the cold for a while because of all implications related to that. So we are dealing with what I call fights between big dogs. And it's very hard for us to really know what is emerging for that. For example, when President Lula said that he had a preference, and also Jobim said a preference for the French, looking from outside and based on my own experience in those things, I never know if this was for real or this was only to change the agenda, was so only to put the agenda in a different scale, or perhaps to have the American side offering something else in addition to what they could offer. There are strong relationships of defense, historical relationships of defense between Brazil and the U.S., as well as there is always the intention of Brazil to maintain some autonomy about procurement. But this does not mean that Brazil has had consistency in procurements. As you know, in going to this area, Brazil had the Mirage, then Brazil has some other planes going to the Navy. At this point, yes, it's necessary for Brazil to modernize. It goes beyond having extra military capacity. It's just modernizing. It's really needed at this point. Mm. The history tells that in relationship with America is always complicated because of all the demands that are not in the domain of the companies providing the products, but are in the political realm. There are many end users agreements that must be obeyed that are in the Congress. So Brazilians feel insecure when they are going to make a decision, and when the product is U.S. because all those implications because of the history. So I suspect that an American company trying to sell a new product to Brazil, although they can assure many things, they also have to consult internally because of the implications that they have here. And this has two ways. For example, another speculation that I would make, I'm not sure whether the Brazilian side is not also interested in postponing the negotiation to see who blinks first in terms of the Tucanos. They're also interested in selling the Tucanos through the defense establishment here. So the decision has not been made. As much as I can postpone the decision to see if I can increase my options, would be better. The bottom line, Leslie, is that I don't know. But what I do know is that there are many more things behind the scenes than the ones that are emerging. So I'm always take with pause some of the things that I read in the press because I never know where are the real strategies behind. In terms of normal cooperation, now that we are having both partners, the U.S. and Brazil, defining a new paradigm for the relationship, this could come as just as natural. But I think it will take time yet for the relationship to mature. We're just having here next week a visit by the newly assigned, it was assigned last year, General, he is the chief of the Joint Staff of the Armed Forces. This is a new institution created inside of the Ministry of Defense of Brazil. This is a new thing. And the intention of the minister is to establish more control on the military branch, so military service. So they are there still in a modernization, also in the concept, in the structure internally. It's very hard to ask for clear definitions when you are still in this mood. We are still in this. So I think we are in this moment in which perhaps this was the wrong moment for this procurement, but it's necessary for Brazil. I believe that as much as they can postpone, the best. And in the end, I would like to have, because of my binational nature, I would like to have these fighters coming from the United States. I would like. I do see there are much more to build on this relationship than it's now emerging.
Before passing the floor to Luigi, one thing, it looks like it's going to be postponed for reasons having to do with the fiscal accounts in Brazil. That's what is in the media. There seems to be, although the window is short, Brazil has to make a decision, I think, by the end of this year, because the time to re-equip, I think after 2014, it becomes very problematic because our equipment is really fading away. The other thing is that never underestimate this important centrality to Brazil of technology transfer. And I think the United States has dealt with, the United States, from what I understand, will have to change some of its laws, some of its regulations to allow more flexibility on dual use. And I assume that the companies that are interested in supplying Brazil and other countries have lobbyists in Washington, and they should go to work. Because if they are interested, I don't think that there is much room here for Brazil just to be happy with something that does not involve technology transfer. Personally, having covered those things, I believe that countries have dealt with nations that are much more complicated and riskier than Brazil ever was or will ever be from the perspective of Western nations. So there is, I think, room, work to be done not only in Brazil, but a lot of work to be done in the United States so legislation evolves here to create the space. And as Luis pointed out, this thing has to be reciprocal. The United States is not the only country on earth that produces airplane. Brazil also does. Brazil produces other things, and the strategic relationship can be built if this becomes a two-way street, and that's why we elect presidents, and that's up to them to figure this out on our behalf. Do you have any more observations? I would like to give Luigi a chance to close.
Quick comment on what Paulo just said, just very short. That's why defining the perception of Brazil in the U.S. Congress is so important. So if regulations need to be changed, if legislation needs to be changed, we need to be talking more about technology transfer, and a lot of these regulations are decided in the U.S. Congress, and the U.S. Congress doesn't have the confidence in Brazil that it should have, then we have all of us have a problem to make that two-way kind of commitment.
Thank you. Luigi, you will close the event right now. Yes.
Oh, no.
Or you make your observation, but you have the floor.
All right. Let me just try to be very, very brief. First of all, I think what Carl just said is 100% on, and combining it with what he said before about Lula not having gone, maybe at the appropriate future stage, President Dilma Rousseff might go to the Congress. Obviously, that has to be prepared in a million ways, politically and in Brazil and here in Washington. On the aircraft, I have been amazed at the pressures that Luis actually described rather well. I also am in favor of postponement for two reasons. One, it's the perfect case to see whether, in fact, out of the new seriousnesses, there can be some new deals made. If there's going to be substance, let's see it now, and certainly arms transfer regulations are a major part. The U.S. does have to understand that Brazil, as Mangabeira Unger, who was a minister at the time, said, will no longer buy products and services off the shelf, period. And that, unless one realizes that, one is not going to get anywhere on selling the. One of the reasons one can postpone is that Brazil has had success with its foreign and defense policies. The successful conclusion of the Peru-Ecuador peace has meant that Peru and Ecuador are no longer buying first-line fighter jets. They do not create additional pressures. The Brazilian Air Force had been asking for new jets back when Fernando Henrique Cardoso was president, and he managed to kick the can forward. Lula kicked the can forward, and now President Rousseff has been suggesting that it might not happen until the end of this year. Let's see what happens. I don't think the pressures are so great. Brazil is not trying, you heard what Luis said, read out of the National Defense Strategy, to project force. They don't need to. What they do need to is to be prepared to have proper deterrence and other things, but there's a lot more to solving problems than being able to bring force to bear immediately. Let me just finish with something.
Yes, sir.
This is The Economist magazine from 2 years ago. In some ways, Brazil outclasses the other BRICS. Unlike China, it is a democracy. Unlike India, it has no insurgents, no ethnic and religious conflicts, nor hostile neighbors. Unlike Russia, it exports more than oil and arms and treats foreign investors with respect. Indeed, when it comes to smart social policy and boosting consumption at home, the developing world has much more to learn from Brazil than from China. Two comments. One, the challenge now is to keep the optimism in that quote alive, because I think that it is also possible that just as Brazilians, and I think I agree with what was said about this, tend to be pro-American, they sometimes tend to be anti-Brazilian. Don't forget little touches of shame when you think of the depths of inequality, of bad education, of still now Dilma having to deal with mudslides above Rio. There are terrible weaknesses and vulnerabilities that need to be overcome in that country. Now, she is good. It is perfectly obvious that she is extraordinarily competent in a million ways. So if this trip can help consolidate images for both countries and maintain the optimism of the London Economist, we're okay. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Luigi. With that, well, 2 rounds of applause. First for our speakers here today. Thank you very much. And the second one is this was Renata. Stay here. Now it's about you. This was the last event managed by Renata Johnson, who is leaving the Brazil Institute this weekend because she is going to have a baby girl, and we have already found someone that will keep